starting off, what was it like, when the initial shutdown occurred, when like it was, everything, show can't go on, everything's stopping? What was that like
Um,
for you?
well, I think like everybody, I think we all were a little dumbfounded as to what this meant. I think we all were afraid is an overstatement. I think being in New York City, which of course was such an epicenter in the first 6 months of COVID, um, there was a frightening aspect to all of this because you didn't know what was going to come out. I mean, with everything else, is whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado, it's sort of like you knew that it had an end. And when you were looking at COVID, it was like we don't know what the end or when the end is going to be. Um, and I think there's a lot of there all kinds of other industries aside from theater where it's like you can do that job if you're, an investment banker, if you are, whatever, you can do that job without actually having other people around. But the whole point of theater is to bring people together. And so, how in the world are you going to do that? Is sort of like the big picture of like theater. And then from the slightly smaller picture of it is like, how do you do school? And it wasn't like we had a lot of time to plan this. I mean, frankly, if we had been smart about this, we would have been going, this is happening in China, it will affect us. And I think everybody was going, oh, it's the coronavirus. It sounds like something that, you put a lime in the bottle and it's a beer, and the joking about it. We should have actually been thinking, what does this actually mean? And there may have been people who did that, but certainly the trickle down to like a theater department was, yeah, that's not going to affect us. And then you saw it start to affect things and went, okay, so how are we going to deal with this? Um, and NYU basically said at spring break, everybody goes home and nobody comes back. And in 7 days, you're going to be doing all of your classes on a computer. And how do you teach theater, especially technical theater or any of the sort of like live acting part of it? How do you do that on a laptop? And how many people actually had sophisticated enough computers to do what it was that we're going to ask them to do? Um, I mean, in retrospect, had something like this happened 10 years ago, the technology that we had would never have been able to do what we asked it to do. Um, so as a faculty, the first things that we did in terms of like, so what's going to happen in 7 days was to go back to the goals and objectives of the classes and said, okay, if we are still to meet those goals and objectives, how do we adjust how we teach in order to do that? Knowing that we are not going to be back, knowing that everything is going to be mediated on computer and internet and blah 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 blah. How do we do that? And go back to what do we want to do to think about how do we get there. The production work that was happening in the department, some things were so far along that it's sort of like, I mean, we were about to go into tech for our final production of the year. Literally, the week after spring break would have been first tech. So everything about that show had been planned to be done with an audience in the room. And so how do you move forward from that? And basically, we did a reading of what the play was to be. Actually, we had two plays, and we made a commitment to the company that we would revisit that production in some way in September, with the idea that by September everything will be fine, right? And but there were other projects that were at sort of like, we just had our first read through. The design process had not gone into a shop yet. There were no lights hung. And for a number of those projects, we basically said, so how do we leverage Zoom to make this into a performance experience? How do we take the idea that we've got camera feeds and we can go, okay, how do we recomposite that so it's not, the Brady Bunch squares on a screen? How do we do something more than that? Can we, play with virtual backgrounds? Can we green screen, all that kind of stuff? And the drama department here at NYU Tisch is gigantic. There are 1,600 students in this department. And so there were probably 20 different projects that actually created some sort of Zoom-based, relatively live experience. And some of them were highly successful. Others were sort of like, well, if we do this, we won't do this again. And I think we all, by the fourth or fifth week into that, sort of went, people can only stay on screen for so long, the Zoom fatigue thing. So the idea of doing a 4-hour-long Shakespeare was like, no, that's not going to happen. And so there was a lot of radical readjustment of things. There was obviously a scaling back of things. There was a lot of, so can we walk around in your apartment with you as to find out what you have that might work as the prop for that moment? And I think that there were some things that were quite beautiful, because we kind of went deep into our theatrical soul of how do we tell stories in a really imaginative way. And then there was one project that we really tried to leverage the technology and sort of like composited screens and did overlays and all that kind of stuff, and went, okay, so this is really hard, but the next time we do something like that, we have ideas on what to do. And then, of course, there was all the heartbreak of like graduating seniors who weren't going to get to their thing and all that sort of stuff. So from the production and design standpoint, we actually did a number of graduation things for that class. We made an evening of connections between the graduating students and alumni, where we actually set up breakout rooms and they got to like meet one-on-one with people. And so, and in some ways we went, wow, this is actually a good idea. And when we're done with all of this, we're going to continue to do that. But the sort of punctuation point of we finished was sort of a soft end to it all. And then we started planning for this academic year, knowing that we might be back and we might not be back. And we went again, what are the goals and how do we get to those goals? The decision was made by the school that the drama department would be remote entirely in the fall, and that we had an expectation that we would be back in some form in the spring. NYU spent a lot of time and energy to put big Zoom carts in every classroom. But from a curriculum standpoint, we had a bunch of faculty meetings where we went, okay, if everything in the fall is going to be remote, what can we teach really well on screen, and what are the things that we need to actually be in a room climbing up a ladder or using a chop saw or using a sewing machine. Those things, let's actually take our curriculum and sort of sort the things that you need to have hands-on from the things that you can do in more of a oral kind of way. And let's move those oral things into the fall, and let's move the tactile things into the spring. And we really took our curriculum, sort of sifted it, reconfigured it, and said, okay, at the end of this year, what do people need to be able to do? And so we built essentially a totally new curriculum for the fall that could be done remotely, and a curriculum for the spring that assumed we would have hands-on. And then we as a department made a case to the university that we wanted an intensive 3 weeks after school ended to just do hands-on stuff. The stuff that we would have normally done in the fall we sort of kicked the can down the road a little bit, going, in the spring, everything will be fine, right? And so we did a 3-week intensive where it was sort of like a thespians conference or something, where you go and it's like, I'm really interested in stage management, so I'm going to go to these 4 different panels and this workshop and that workshop. So we set up about 55 to 60 different workshops in that 3-week period, and the students chose the things that they wanted to learn. And frankly, it was ungraded, but everybody got an A because they showed up and were in good spirits. So all of those were done in person, in the costume shop, in the theater, in our light lab, in the scene shop. And the groups were small enough that we were able to deal with social distancing. And I would say that at the end of the 3-week intensive, we really did accomplish everything that we would normally have done in a year. It was it's like we took the cards and we reshuffled them so they were in a different order. And now we go back to planning for next year. It's like, what did we learn from that? And what do we go back to, and how do we modify what we go back to given what we learned from this year? So that was a really long explanation about a bunch of things. From a production standpoint, we proceeded to do the 2 projects that were about to go into tech as 2 virtual projects using Zoom as sort of the basic platform. Then we did 2 more projects that were really curated from the standpoint of, we know these will be done online, so how do we really leverage the online experience for it? And then in the spring, we did a production of Urinetown, the musical, where the actors were in the theater, the technicians were in the theater. We had 11 cameras in the theater from all different angles and all this kind of stuff. We did 2 full runs and recorded both of them, and did very little post-production editing. There was some little glitch things that we fixed, but basically opening night was live, and the subsequent evenings we ran a recording of that. The university would not allow us to have live singing. So that was all pre-recorded and then essentially lip-synced. But all of the actors had on masks anyway. So it was the easiest lip-syncing job they will ever have. And we had the majority of the cast was in the theater, but there were also cast members who were remote green screened into the performance so that it was like a real mashup of all the different technologies, whether it was recorded, live, remote, in person, all that sort of stuff. And I think that it worked really well. And I think we learned a lot from it, we being both the students and the adults in the room. And I think the silver lining of that particular thing was we reached a much bigger audience than we would have ever been able to do in a 10 performance run in our theater. We had audience from 27 different countries seeing these productions, and it was $14 to stream it into your home, which meant that there were families in Idaho who paid $14 to see a college production of Urinetown on the big screen in their basement, you know? And so from an accessibility standpoint and an outreach standpoint, that was crazy successful, you know? Especially in a world where everything is sort of like, why are we doing this to ourselves? Is this what we should be doing? Should we be trying to make theater something that everybody can attend, as opposed to the people who, you know, especially in New York, and you talk about Broadway, it's like, who can really afford to drop $150 to see a show? Not everybody, but 7 people in your living room for $14, it kind of, you know, hit that world too. So yeah, that was a long monologue.
Well, it was very good. You covered a lot of questions I was going to ask you in that in one go. So yeah, that was pretty good. A thing I did want to ask you, because people have had varying opinions on this, is, you know, Zoom theater and Zoom performances, like, is that theater? Would you consider that to be theater?
I think from the side of up to the camera, yes. I mean, all the work that you do in preparing, whether it is creating virtual backgrounds or painting a backdrop, that's the same. Whether it is rehearsing lines with 2 people on screens or 2 people in a room, that's the same. You know, costuming is the same. Lighting gets a little bit different, obviously, because you're designing lights for a camera as opposed to a human eye. Sound is obviously mediated in a lot of ways. I think the audience experience is different. I mean, if I'm sitting, you know, in my bedroom with my iPad watching The Tempest, that's not the same as sitting shoulder to shoulder with 600 other people in a thrust theater watching an actor sweat outdoors because it's 80 degrees and 100% humidity. And so the sort of community experience of it, I think, is not the same. Is it television? No. Is it film? No. Is it theater? Kinda. You know, it's like, it's a weird hybrid, you know. And I would say that if we had all of the money in the world and all of the time in the world, it would become film. Because all of a sudden it's like, well, I didn't like that particular take, and I didn't like that camera angle, and all of a sudden it's like you're doing movies. So there's something that's different between what we do making theater that actually is seen in a Zoom or streaming format, and film. And I think it's also different than somebody who has done sort of an archival recording of something, you know, and it's like, there's 3 cameras in the theater and they've shot the show and blah, 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 blah. I mean, that archival experience of in the Heights that you could see at Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library is different than the movie In the Heights. And I will admit that I have not seen the Hamilton video. I think that may be closer, but I think even that has been so curated that it's no longer like watching a live performance. But I put a big asterisk on there. I haven't seen it, so I don't know what I'm talking about, really.
I mean, I'd agree. I've seen it. It is, very edited. It's not, just simply watching it. And I agree that the curation of all these different the performance and trying to make things perfect and stuff kind of makes it lose a lot of the things that theater has.
Right.
So
well, and there's the spontaneity, and there is the potential for disaster that is like, that's why sometimes you go to theater to see, are they going to be able to pull that off? How do they do that? All that sort of stuff. That sort of, sleight of hand of the magician is actually more exciting when you're watching it live than when you're watching it through a screen. Because when you watch it through a screen, you know that they can manipulate it. When you're sitting in a theater and there's humans in front of you and suddenly that person disappears, it's like, well, how in the hell did they do that? So it's not the same, but it's, frankly, it's what we had to work with. So that's what we did.
Yeah, and your description of the production of Urinetown, where you had some people at home, some people, and that's incredible. I would just kind of ask how exactly did you pull that off? I'm just really intrigued by that.
There was a lot of planning. I mean, like any good production, you do your planning, right? So you try to eliminate all of the potential, disasters in advance. The premise of the production was that NYU did not require all the students to come back to campus in the spring. So there were students who were going to be on Zoom. And then there were going to be students who were in the dorms and coming to class and all that sort of stuff. So these main stage productions are open to any student in the department who's a sophomore or beyond. So to say to a student who's in Poughkeepsie, you can't be in this show, just wasn't going to fly. So we went into the process knowing that some aspect of the cast was going to be online, was going to be on screen. The design of the show, the scenic design of the show said that there were going to be screens in the sets so like the You're in Good Company corporate office had a big screen that was sort of like his surveillance of the world. Well, surveillance and the world, it's like, okay, so here is a way to input actors who are not in the room into that storytelling. The amenities, I don't know if you know the show a little bit. I mean,
a little bit, yeah.
So basically they have to pay to pee.
Yeah.
And so the place that they go to pee is called the amenity. And the person who was taking tickets, right, lived in a monitor that was part of the set. There are two cops. One is Lockstock and the other is Barrel. Lockstock was a physical actor in the room, and Barrel was an iPad on his shoulder. So the planning of the show knew that we were going to incorporate actors who were not there. When we then auditioned, we started looking at, okay, so who's in the room, who's not going to be in the room, who's got to be remote. How do we cast those people into the roles that are not physically in the room. And in fact, the sort of like the lock, stock, and barrel thing was sort of like, we got two actors who are perfect for the cops. One's going to be in the room, one's not. How are we going to solve that problem? So the planning really tried to take into account the idea that we were blending all of this stuff. We also, when we hired the director, said, these are your marching orders. You will do this. This is part of how the show has to happen. And we had a much longer design process. I mean, normally our design process would be about 4 or 5 weeks. This one was about 7 or 8 weeks. The rehearsal process, once again, going back to the sort of Zoom fatigue, normally would have been about 3.5 to 4 weeks. It was 7 weeks. The tech process, which normally would have been, quote, hell week, right? There's like 1 week was 3 weeks. And all of those rehearsals were like 3 hours long as opposed to 4 hours long. There were no 10 out of 12 rehearsals. All of that kind of stuff is sort of like, so in elongating the process, it also gave us more time to go, okay, so how do we solve that problem? How do we solve that problem? How do we solve that problem? We added a video designer. We added sort of a technical director for camera shots and all that kind of stuff. So we really planned it to within an inch of its life. And then, of course, things went wrong. And then you go say, okay, so how do we solve that? And I mean, the original surveillance design actually was going to be all of these sort of like small television monitors. And sort of like of all different vintages. The design concept was diesel punk, right? So it's sort of the next generation after steampunk is sort of like diesel engines. So all of those monitors were supposed to be like different time periods. And we realized a little late in the process that the amount of processing power that we needed to talk to each one of those screens, we weren't going to be able to do. So we ended up like taking the faces of all of those things and putting a big monitor behind it and then mapping individual things behind each of them. Clearly there's going to be tiers where, my idea didn't work and that sort of stuff. But I think going into it, knowing that we were going to address these particular concerns and saying, this is what we must do. It's sort of like going back to what is the goal of the class and like, how do I get there? So what was the goal of the production? The goal of the production was to incorporate all this technology and the knowledge that we had people, actors, technicians, stage managers who were on Zoom. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do this. So what's the path that gets us there? I think that was the only production action that the main stage did in the spring. Normally we would have done the musical and another 2 shows, but we really concentrated all of our effort on the one project and used almost the whole semester to make it happen. If we didn't have that time and we didn't have that sort of like extra focus, we wouldn't have been able to pull that off.
It seems like you seem pretty like, positive and like you feel like you did a good job and like NYU did a good job of like making theater happen and, giving that, which is like not something that everyone has felt. Like a lot of people have like lost things, but you guys have really like, found ways to work around the problem and create theater in a pandemic. So my next question is just, what about the future? What are you doing, going to be doing, like moving forward, having done all of this things that you probably would have never thought to do? What does the future look like?
Well, my crystal ball remains a little cloudy. we're also waiting to see what the university will allow us to do in the fall. At this stage of the game, the university has made it fairly clear that everybody will be back on campus, that social distancing, like there was just a thing that came through this morning, that social distancing is being sort of like phased out, but masks are still being used, at least for the summer. All the students and all the employees must be vaccinated coming back in the fall, which I hope means that we will no longer need to wear masks, because that's frankly the hardest part about teaching in a classroom is the damn mask. So the way we are approaching the fall productions is we're assuming that we will be in the space. We're at this point assuming that we will not be wearing masks. The first show that we're doing in the fall is Gorky's The Lower Depths, which is about people, really poor people living in sort of squalor, and half of them actually have tuberculosis. So if we were to need to wear masks, we actually have chosen a show where masks could be part of the costume, which was also part of the design conceit in Urinetown. We are intending, because the university at this point is saying no non-NYU people will be allowed into our buildings, so no audience. But we could have an audience of NYU faculty, NYU students, that sort of thing. So our intent is to actually do a shortened run. So we would normally do 10 performances. We're doing 4. And we're going to record the show so that if I can't come into the building, I can see my grandchild in the college production sort of thing. I think that particular piece, once again, going to sort of accessibility, is something that will remain. Now, the thing that everybody is fighting with is the rights to shows are for generally live performance with live audiences in a room, and the royalties you pay are based on the seating capacity generally, and whether you're amateur or professional, that sort of thing. So a lot of the companies that controlled the rights during this 15 months basically said, it's okay, you can broadcast this, but you're going to use our streaming service. So they got a cut of every ticket, right? Some of the organizations that are controlling the rights are going back to, no, you can't do that. You can only do live audience. So again, part of the reason why we chose Gorky's Lower Depths is that the play is actually in the public domain and we can do anything we want to with it. So we'll see. I mean, I think that going forward, the idea that we want to reach a wider audience, that we want to reach an audience that might not be able to fly to New York, pay for a hotel, buy a ticket, we would still like those people to be able to see the shows. So there is that as sort of like a background hope. But there's always new roadblocks that show up that sort of go, okay, so how are you going to deal with that? So our first project is Gorky's Lower Depths. The next thing that we're doing is an adaptation of Euripides' The Bacchae. So once again, a play that 2,000 some years old. And that piece has a companion piece that's devised based on the themes in the Bacchae. So the fall we've selected shows that we can do whatever we want to in order to get them out into the world. I think part of our planning has been to sort of think about what is the hybrid of the future. Our rehearsals are going to go from 4-hour rehearsals to 3-hour rehearsals. Our tech period is being pulled back so that it's fewer hours. I don't know if you're aware of this sort of no more 10 out of 12s movement that's out there. So we've eliminated 10 out of 12 rehearsals from our production calendar. And this idea about accessibility remains sort of front and center. Not that we were ever that expensive. I mean, it's $14 to see a show is not that awful. But for some people, $14 is a lot of money. For a college student, that could be money I don't have. So how do we make sure that everybody who wants to see a show gets to see a show? But then that changes the economics of your show budgets and everything else, because if you don't, they could be free, but if you depend on that income to pay for scenery and costumes or whatever, and now you've eliminated that, so how do you do your shows? So I think there's a certain amount of, we're going to get back to some kind of normal, but what is that normal? I think we have yet to see. And as New York State loosens up stuff, then we are allowed to do more things too. So we're a little bit at the mercy of whatever the government tells us we can do, and then the university is going to interpret that in such a way to limit its risks as well. And at a certain point, you go, it is the school play, and the purpose for doing school plays is not so much the performance. It's about learning how to get to the performance. So we can do that as much as we like now. So it's just not as much fun if you never get to have it in front of an audience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. You answered pretty much all of my questions. I only had to ask 3 of them. I like to always end the interview with just seeing if there's anything else that you wanted, me to cover or highlight in my podcast. If there's anything you notice that you think is interesting that I should know. It's okay if the answer is no.
I think somewhere in here, I'm hoping that people who did not get exposed to theater because they were so involved with soccer or so involved with swim team or whatever have gotten exposed to it. Mm-hmm. And not to become theater makers, but to be audiences that, your friends who would have come to see a show didn't get to see a show, but maybe they got to see something online. And maybe the group of people who normally didn't see theater got to see theater and saw something about the power of the storytelling. I think that artists have always led the way in terms of social change. And I think that this has been obviously a moment to be reflective about society, about the United States, about the world we live in, and what we should be doing. I'm hoping that art will find a way to deal with the divisiveness of the country that we're living in right now. That people who didn't normally see theater got to see something, and maybe they walk away with a new opinion about something. And so my hope is that, we've been able, as artists, we've been able to reach people who would never have seen this before. Whether or not that's true, I remain hopeful that it's, a little somewhere. But it's I have friends who, have nothing to do with theater, have nothing to do with education, aside from you have kids and grandchildren or whatever in school. It's like they saw Urinetown. It's like, oh, that's what you do. It's like, and what do you think about the story? And what do you think about corporate takeover? And what do you think about Big Brother? And it's like, oh, so that's what theater is about. So, I do think that, at least from that personal little bit of, for people who had never done that before, saw something, maybe they start to think about other things as well. So that's the hope. So we, as artists, we continue to make social change, and there's a lot that's needed right now.